Before we begin the sermon today, I want to thank Ted Batt, who is here today as our sermon illustration about pottery. And Ted, we are so blessed that you're with us, and thank you for being here. Well, it was time for Jeremiah to go down to the potter's house and to learn a lesson about God, life, faith, and choices. As Jeremiah went down to the potter's house, he found the potter there working with clay, and as he was working with the clay, the potter would find at times that the vessel didn't look like he wanted, so he would smash it down and start over again. As Jeremiah watched the potter, he heard God speaking to him and telling him that God, who was faithful in the beginning of creation, continues to be faithful, just like the potter working with his clay. God continues to work with us. There is a phrase we use for that. It's from the Latin. It's called creatio continua, which means that God, when creation began, did not stop creating, but God continues to be in the act of creation. So as Jeremiah went to the potter and to watch him, he learned a lesson about how God is still active and how God himself makes choices on our behalf. As Jeremiah watched the potter working, he also learned a lesson about life. And the lesson is this, is that we have choices that we make with our lives that impact our relationship with God and how God deals with us. Do you remember what God told Jeremiah and the house of Israel? Can I not do with you, O house of Israel, just as this potter has done, says the Lord? Just like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. At one moment I may declare concerning a nation or kingdom that I will pluck it up and break down and destroy it. But if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will change my mind about the disaster that I intended to bring on it. And at another moment I may declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build it and plant it. But if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, then I will change my mind about the good that I intended to do so with it. You know, at times we might think that we're the people who have the opportunity to choose, to make our choices. But what Jeremiah teaches us is that God is still in the business of making choices, that God is in the business of responding to life. Now, we're here today because we are believers in Jesus Christ, or we seek to be disciples of Jesus. At one time in my life, when I first began my Christian walk of faith in the church I was growing up in, there was an understanding that faith in Jesus Christ was a one-time choice. We talked about making a decision for Jesus. And the thought of it was that the choice to follow Jesus was the choice of a lifetime. Well, after 43 years of being in ministry, I've come to a different understanding of what faith means in Jesus. And what I've come to realize is that faith in Jesus is not the choice of a lifetime, but that faith in Jesus is a lifetime of choices. Faith in Jesus is not the choice of a lifetime, it is a lifetime of faithful choices in Jesus. And I've come to that understanding because of the Old Testament readings that we heard today from Jeremiah and from Deuteronomy. And as I heard it, it made me think of where in my life am I making choices now to be a follower of Jesus? How am I aligning my life so that as God works with my life, that I will be a vessel that God desires? There's a word we call the choices of our lifetime to be followers of Jesus, and that word is covenant. Covenant was an understanding that in the Bible, that when God calls us, we respond. You might remember the story of Noah and how God called Noah to build an ark, and how that was something that was unusual because in the biblical account, they had not yet had rain up to this time. And so for Noah to do this when there was not yet water around meant that Noah had to do two things. One, he had to trust God, and two, he had to choose to obey and do what God called him to do. Well, if you recall the story, there was the flood, and as the flood came, at the end of the flooding, God placed a sign in the clouds in the sky as a sign of God's covenant, and that was the rainbow. It was a sign of God's choice to be faithful, and by the sign of the rainbow, it was God stating that he would never again destroy the earth by flood. Later in the Genesis, you find the story of Abram and Sarai, who were called to go to a land where they had never lived before. It required a choice of faithfulness on their part to be willing to go to where God was calling them to a place where they had never gone before. Out of their faithfulness, God created a nation called Israel, and we're a part of that heritage of faith. In the New Testament, there was the call of Jesus to the disciples to follow him, and the sign of his covenant was that he would make them fishers of people. The biblical faith is the story of God's choice to be in affiliation or in covenant with us, and of our choice to be in covenant with God. We choose to honor God through the choices that we make, trusting that God, like a potter, will act upon our lives. In the Bible, faith is the word we use to define our relationship with God. In the book, Wishful Thinking of Theological ABC, Frederick Buechner writes these words about faith. He says, faith is better understood as a verb than as a noun, as a process than a possession. It is on again, off again, rather than once and for all. Faith is not being sure where you're going, but going anyway, a journey without maps. Well, our other lesson today from Deuteronomy comes at a time when Israel has been in the wilderness for 40 years. And they're about to enter into the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And as they are preparing to go into this new land, Moses, who has been their leader for 40 years, is nearing the end of his life, and he knows he'll not be going with them into the promise of a new land. And so he gathers them together, and he challenges them to a lesson about God, faith, life, and choices. And here is what Moses tells the people of Israel. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. Did you notice the emphasis of what Moses said? If you obey the commandments of the Lord that I am commanding you today. Faith is a faith of today. It begins with a walk of trust, but it does not end there. It is an ongoing act of covenant. Well, why do we choose to walk with faith in Jesus Christ? We choose to walk with faith in Jesus so that we might go to the potter's house and learn a lesson about God and life, faith, and choices. We do so that we might follow Jesus. Friends, it's time for us to go to the potter's house. What choices are you making today? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Amen. Thank you, Potter, for being with us today.